Now that your husband is dead, grieve, pack your bags, and never come back, my daughter-in-law said across the dinner table the night after the funeral. I remember the exact way the words sounded in the quiet room, sharp and deliberate, as if she had practiced them beforehand. The fork in my hand paused halfway to my mouth. For a moment, no one spoke. My son Daniel sat beside her, staring down at his plate, as if the mashed potatoes required his full attention. Not once did he look at me. Not once did he say a word. The dining room suddenly felt too large for the three of us, the long oak table stretching between us like a distance that had been growing for years without me noticing. My name is Margaret Collins, and at 71 years old, that was the moment I realized my family had already decided my place in the world. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply set my fork down beside my plate and folded my hands in my lap while the silence thickened in the room. Outside the tall dining room windows, the autumn evening had already settled over the neighborhood. The maple trees in the yard Noel planted 30 years ago were beginning to lose their leaves, scattering red and gold across the grass. He loved those trees. He used to say they made the house feel alive. For 32 years, my husband and I built our life in that house, room by room, paycheck by paycheck. We raised Daniel there. We celebrated birthdays, graduations, quiet Sunday dinners. Every wall held a memory. And yet in that moment, sitting across from my daughter-in-law, I realized the house no longer felt like home. Romy leaned back in her chair with a small, satisfied smile that never quite reached her eyes. It's just practical, she continued calmly, as if discussing something mundane like grocery shopping. A house this big is too much for some of your age. Daniel and I have been talking about expanding the family. We need the space. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair, clearing his throat but still avoiding my gaze. The boy who once clung to my arm on his first day of kindergarten now seemed like a stranger sitting across the table. I watched him carefully, waiting for him to say something, anything that might remind me he was still the son I had spent decades raising. But the words never came. Instead, he nodded once, slowly, as if agreeing with a business proposal rather than the quiet eviction of his own mother. The chandelier above the table cast a soft yellow glow across the polished wood surface. I had cleaned that chandelier just 2 weeks earlier, standing carefully on a small ladder while Noel steadied it with his familiar patience. That memory pressed into my chest with a weight I wasn't ready to face yet. It had been only 7 days since we buried him. 7 days since I stood beside his grave, holding Daniel's hand while the minister spoke about a life well lived. 7 days since the man who had protected me for more than 3 decades disappeared from the world, leaving behind a silence that filled every corner of the house. Romy tapped her nails lightly against the table, the faint clicking sound echoing in the stillness. 2 weeks should be enough time, she said. You can find a nice senior community somewhere. They have activities. People your own age. Her tone carried the kind of polite sweetness people use when they are pretending to do something kind. I studied her face carefully then, noticing the calm confidence behind her words. This was not a sudden decision. They had discussed it before tonight, perhaps many times. My eyes drifted to the empty chair at the head of the table where Noel used to sit every evening. I could almost hear his voice, warm and steady, asking Daniel about work or reminding me not to worry about the bills. He always handled those things. He used to say a husband's job was to make sure his wife never felt unsafe in her own home. I wondered what he would have said if he had been sitting there tonight. Perhaps he would have laughed at the absurdity of it all. Or perhaps he would have stood up from the table with that quiet authority of his and reminded everyone exactly who built that house. But Noel was gone, and the chair remained empty. I pushed my plate away and slowly stood up from the table. My legs felt strangely steady despite the weight pressing against my chest. I see, I said quietly. My voice surprised even me with how calm it sounded. Romy watched me carefully, perhaps expecting an argument or a tearful protest. Instead, I simply picked up my napkin and placed it neatly beside my plate. Daniel finally looked up then, just for a moment, but the expression in his eyes was something worse than anger. It was indifference, the kind that comes when someone has already convinced themselves they are doing the right thing. I turned and walked toward the hallway without another word. The house felt different as I moved through it, each step echoing softly against the hardwood floors Noel had installed himself the year Daniel graduated from high school. The walls were lined with family photographs, Christmas mornings, beach vacations, Daniel's wedding day, smiling faces frozen in happier years. I climbed the staircase slowly, running my fingers along the polished wooden railing Noel had sanded smooth with his own hands. When I reached the bedroom we had shared for more than 3 decades, I paused at the doorway. His reading glasses still rested on the nightstand beside the bed. His favorite flannel shirt hung neatly over the chair in the corner. The faint scent of his aftershave lingered in the air, familiar and comforting and painfully recent. I sat down on the edge of the bed and looked around the room that had once felt like the safest place in the world. Downstairs I could hear faint voices as Daniel and Romy continued their conversation, already discussing things as if I had quietly disappeared. For the first time in my life, I understood something important about silence. Sometimes silence is not weakness. Sometimes it is the moment when a person begins to see the truth clearly. And that night, sitting alone in the bedroom Noel and I had shared for 32 years, I realized something else as well. They believed I had nowhere to go. They believed the story of my life ended the moment my husband died. What they didn't know yet was that Noel Collins had never been a careless man. And before he left this world, he made sure of something very important. I did not sleep much that night. The house was too quiet without Noel's breathing beside me, and every creak in the hallway sounded louder than it ever had before. For more than 30 years our home had carried a certain rhythm, the small sounds of 2 people living side by side, the soft closing of cabinets, the hum of the coffee maker early in the morning, the familiar footsteps moving through the kitchen. Now, the silence felt heavy, like the air itself was waiting for something. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at the framed photograph on Noel's nightstand. It was taken 15 years earlier during a summer trip to Cape Cod. Daniel had insisted on taking the picture himself, laughing as the wind kept blowing my hair across my face while Noel wrapped his arm around my shoulders. In the photograph, we both looked younger, relaxed, the way people look when they believe their family will always stay whole. I reached over and picked up Noel's reading glasses, still resting exactly where he had left them a week earlier. The lenses caught the faint light from the hallway and reflected it back toward me. For a moment, I almost expected him to walk through the door and ask why I was still awake. He used to say that worry never solved anything after midnight. But midnight had already passed, and worry was not the only thing sitting beside me anymore. Something else had taken its place. A quiet awareness that the world I thought I understood had shifted in ways I had never imagined. Downstairs, I heard the soft murmur of voices again. Daniel and Romy were still awake. Their conversation floated faintly through the floorboards, too quiet for me to understand the words, but clear enough to remind me that decisions were being made without me. I placed Noel's glasses back on a nightstand and stood up slowly, crossing the bedroom toward the window. Outside, the yard stretched into the darkness, the maple trees rustling gently in the autumn breeze. Noel had planted them during our second year in the house. I remembered him digging each hole himself on a hot Saturday afternoon, while Daniel followed him around the yard, carrying a small plastic shovel that was nearly as big as he was. That was the year Daniel turned 6. He had been so proud of those trees, telling everyone at school that he helped his father build a garden. I wondered if he remembered any of that now, or if those memories had faded the same way his loyalty seemed to have faded tonight at the dinner table. Eventually, I walked down the hallway, toward the staircase. The house looked different in the dim light, familiar yet strangely distant, as though I was seeing it through someone else's eyes. Each framed photograph along the wall held pieces of our life together. Daniel's high school graduation, Christmas mornings with stacks of wrapped presents beneath the tree, Noel standing beside the barbecue grill with that patient smile he always wore when Daniel tried to help cook burgers in the backyard. I paused at the top of the stairs when I heard Romy's voice again, clearer now as it drifted up from the living room. 2 weeks is generous, she was saying. Most people would not give that long. Daniel answered quietly, his voice hesitant. She will understand eventually. The words settled into my chest like a slow realization. They truly believed this plan was reasonable. They believed I would pack my life into a few boxes and leave the only home I had known for 3 decades without question. I stood there listening for another moment, but the conversation shifted to something quieter, and I could no longer hear the details. I turned and walked back toward the bedroom instead. There was nothing downstairs that required my presence anymore. Inside the bedroom, I opened the closet and looked at Noel's suits hanging neatly along the rack. He had always taken care of his things with quiet discipline. Every jacket pressed, every tie folded exactly the same way. I ran my hand lightly across the sleeve of his navy blue suit, the one he wore every Sunday to church. He used to joke that a good suit could carry a man through almost any situation. The memory brought the faintest hint of a smile to my face before it faded again. When I closed the closet door, my eyes fell on something I had not noticed earlier. A small wooden box sat on the dresser near Noel's side of the room. It was simple and polished, about the size of a paperback book, the kind of box people sometimes use for personal papers or old letters. I walked closer and recognized it immediately. Noel kept important documents there, things he did not want misplaced among the usual clutter of bills and receipts. For years, I had barely paid attention to it. Noel handled most of our paperwork himself, insisting that I should not spend my time worrying. About finances. You focus on living, he used to tell me. I will take care of the rest. I hesitated for a moment before lifting the lid. Inside were several neatly arranged envelopes, each labeled in Noel's careful handwriting. Insurance papers, tax records, property documents, everything organized exactly the way he liked it. Then I noticed one envelope placed slightly apart from the others. My name was written across the front in bold blue ink. Margaret, just that one word. I stared at the envelope for a long time before touching it. Noel had written my name with the same steady handwriting he used for grocery lists and birthday cards. But something about the way it was placed in the box made it feel different, almost deliberate, as if he knew that one day I would open this box alone and find it waiting for me. Slowly, I picked up the envelope and turned it over in my hands. The paper felt heavier than I expected, thick and official. I had not opened it yet, but even before breaking the seal, I could feel a quiet certainty settling in my chest. Noel had always been a careful man, and careful men rarely leave the future to chance. For a long time, I did not open the envelope. I simply stood there beside the dresser, holding it in both hands as if it were something fragile that might disappear if I moved too quickly. The bedroom was quiet except for the faint ticking of the old clock Noel had bought during our 10th anniversary trip to Vermont. He always liked things that lasted a long time. Solid wood furniture, mechanical watches, houses built with real brick instead of thin siding. He used to say that anything worth building should still stand strong long after you are gone. That thought lingered in my mind as I finally slid one finger beneath the seal and opened the envelope. Inside was a folded document printed on thick paper. I recognized the letterhead immediately. Carter and Whitmore Legal Services. Noel's attorney had worked with us for years, mostly handling small things like taxes and property records. I had met him only a few times, usually when Noel insisted I join them for lunch after a meeting downtown. He always spoke politely but directly, the way lawyers do when they are used to explaining serious matters. In simple language, I unfolded the document slowly and began reading. The words were clear, precise, and written in the calm tone of legal writing. It described a family trust that had been established several years earlier. My name appeared near the top of the page as the primary beneficiary. The address of our house followed beneath it, along with a description of the property boundaries that stretched across 3/4 of an acre at the end of Maple Ridge Drive. I read the paragraph twice before the meaning fully settled in my mind. According to the document, the house had been placed into the trust 5 years ago. The trust named Noel as the original trustee and listed me as the successor trustee upon his passing. In plain language, it meant that the property was legally protected and could not be sold or transferred without my consent. My hands remained steady as I continued reading, but inside something quiet and powerful began to shift. Noel had planned this long before tonight's conversation at the dinner table. He had arranged it carefully, making certain that the home we built together would remain under my control no matter what happened after he was gone. There was also a short handwritten note attached to the document. The handwriting was unmistakably Noel's, slightly slanted but strong, written with the same fountain pen he had carried for years. Margaret, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to explain things myself. I know how much you trust people, and that is one of the things I love most about you. But sometimes trust needs a little protection. Everything we built together belongs to you. The house, the land, and the right to decide what happens next. Do not let anyone convince you otherwise. I stood there reading those lines several times, feeling the calm certainty behind his words. Noel had never been dramatic. He believed in preparation rather than confrontation. If he expected trouble, he handled it quietly long before it arrived. I folded the document carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Downstairs, the house had grown quiet again. Daniel and Romy must have gone to bed. The silence felt different now, less oppressive than it had earlier in the evening. I walked to the window again and looked out at the dark yard where the maple trees swayed gently in the night wind. For the first time since the dinner conversation, the weight in my chest began to lift slightly. Noel had known something I had not fully understood until now. Families do not always stay the same as the years pass. People change, priorities shift, and sometimes the people you once protected begin believing they're entitled to everything you have. I placed the envelope back inside the wooden box and closed the lid slowly. There was no need to rush. Morning would come soon enough, and with it another day inside the house that Daniel and Romy believed would soon belong to them. I walked toward the bed and turned off the lamp beside Noel's nightstand. The room faded into darkness except for the soft glow of moonlight spilling across the floor. For the first time since the funeral, I lay down and allowed my eyes to close without fear of what tomorrow might bring. Noel had left me more than memories. He had left me the quiet assurance that the life we built together was not something that could be taken away simply because someone decided it was convenient. And somewhere downstairs in the silent rooms of the house, two people slept peacefully, believing they had already won a future that was never truly theirs. Morning arrived quietly, the pale light of early autumn slipping through the curtains and spreading across the bedroom floor. For a moment, I lay still beneath the blankets, listening to the familiar sounds of the house waking up. The refrigerator hummed softly in the kitchen below. A car passed slowly along Maple Ridge Drive outside. The world continued its routine as if nothing had changed, yet everything inside me felt different from the night before. I sat up slowly and looked toward Noel's side of the bed. The pillow remained undisturbed, the blanket folded exactly the way it had been since the morning the paramedics took him away. I had not moved it. Part of me believed that as long as his side of the bed remained untouched, some small piece of his presence still lingered in the room. The envelope rested inside the wooden box on the dresser where I had placed it before going to sleep. I walked over and opened the lid again, not because I doubted what I had read, but because I wanted to feel the quiet certainty of those words once more. The document inside the envelope had not changed. The trust was real. The house on Maple Ridge Drive belonged under my authority now. Noel had made certain of that long before illness or funerals entered our lives. I closed the box again and carried it back to the dresser. Downstairs, I could hear movement in the kitchen, cabinet doors opening, the sound of a chair sliding across the tile floor. Romy was awake. She always rose early, moving through the house with the brisk energy of someone who believed efficiency was a virtue. For years, I had tried to interpret that energy as enthusiasm, but over time I realized it carried something else beneath it, a quiet determination to reshape every room and every routine according to her preferences. I dressed slowly, choosing a simple gray sweater and dark slacks from the closet. When I looked at myself in the mirror above the dresser, the woman staring back at me seemed older than she had a week earlier. Grief had a way of settling into a person's expression, deepening the lines around the eyes and mouth. Yet beneath the sadness there was something steadier now, something calm that had not been there yesterday evening at the dinner table. I walked down the staircase carefully, my hand resting along the smooth wooden railing Noelle had installed many years earlier. The scent of fresh coffee greeted me halfway down the hall. In the kitchen, Romy stood at the counter, scrolling through her phone while the coffee maker gurgled quietly beside her. She glanced up briefly when I entered the room, her expression polite but distant. "Good morning," she said in a tone that suggested routine rather than warmth. I nodded once and moved toward the cabinet where the mugs were kept. The simple familiarity of the motion felt comforting. For decades, my mornings had begun the same way. Coffee poured into Noelle's favorite ceramic mug, 2 slices of toast in the toaster, the sound of the morning news playing softly on the small television near the window. Today, the television remained silent. Daniel entered the kitchen a few moments later, his hair still slightly disheveled from sleep. He paused when he saw me standing beside the counter, as if uncertain whether our conversation from the night before should be acknowledged or ignored. "Morning, Mom," he said finally. His voice sounded careful, almost rehearsed. I poured coffee into a mug and carried it to the small round table near the window where Noelle and I had eaten breakfast for more than 30 years. Outside, the maple trees glowed softly in the morning light, their leaves shifting between red and amber as the breeze moved through them. Daniel and Romy remained near the counter, speaking quietly to each other. After a moment, Daniel walked over and sat across from me. He rested his hands on the table, avoiding my eyes for a few seconds before finally looking up. "We should probably talk about yesterday," he said. I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "There is nothing urgent to discuss," I replied calmly. My voice surprised him. I could see it in the slight narrowing of his eyes. He had expected something else. An argument perhaps, or tears. Instead, I simply watched the sunlight moving across the surface of the table. Romy joined us a moment later, sitting beside Daniel with the confident posture she always carried. "We just want to make sure you have enough time to arrange things," she said smoothly. "Moving can take planning." I folded my hands around the warm mug and looked at both of them carefully. They truly believed the future had already been decided. In their minds, the house was simply waiting for my departure. For the first time since Noelle's funeral, I felt the faintest hint of his quiet humor echo in my thoughts. He had always said that patience reveals more about a situation than anger ever could. So I did what Noelle would have done. I listened. I allowed them to continue speaking about timelines and possibilities and practical arrangements. They discussed paint colors for the upstairs bedroom, renovations for the kitchen, even the possibility of building a small office where Noelle once kept his tools. I said very little. I simply sat there beside the window, sipping my coffee while the autumn sunlight moved slowly across the floor. And the entire time, neither of them realized that the future they were planning no longer belonged to them at all. The rest of the morning unfolded quietly, almost peacefully, as if the house itself had decided to pretend that nothing unusual had happened the night before. After finishing my coffee, I carried the mug to the sink and rinsed it slowly, watching the steam fade into the cool air above the basin. Romy had already moved to the living room with her laptop, the faint clicking of keys drifting through the hallway as she worked. Daniel left for the office shortly after breakfast, grabbing his car keys from the small wooden bowl near the front door without saying much more than a quick goodbye. When the door closed behind him, the house returned to its familiar stillness, the kind of quiet that had once felt comforting during the many mornings when Noelle and I were the only people inside these walls. I walked through the living room and paused near the fireplace where several framed photographs stood in a neat row along the mantel. One showed Daniel at 8 years old holding a fishing rod beside Noelle at Lake Champlain. Another captured our 25th wedding anniversary dinner in a small restaurant overlooking the harbor in Boston. There were years of life in those photographs, years of effort and patience and ordinary happiness. I wondered briefly if Daniel ever looked at them anymore, or if they had simply become part of the background the way furniture becomes invisible after you have lived with it long enough. Romy glanced up from her laptop when I entered the room, but quickly returned to whatever she was reading on the screen. I stepped onto the back porch and closed the door quietly behind me. The air carried the cool, crisp scent of autumn, and the maple trees at the edge of the yard rustled gently in the breeze. Noel used to sit on this porch every Saturday morning with a newspaper folded beneath his arm and a cup of coffee balanced on the railing beside him. He liked the quiet hours before the neighborhood fully woke up. I could almost hear his voice again, reminding me that patience reveals more truth than confrontation ever will. The thought stayed with me as I walked back inside the house. By midday, Romy had begun moving through the rooms with a measuring tape and a small notebook in her hand. I watched quietly from the kitchen doorway as she stretched the tape along the dining room wall and scribbled numbers across the page. When she noticed me standing there, she offered a quick explanation as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She said she was simply getting ideas for future renovations, thinking about how the space might look with lighter paint and larger windows. I nodded politely and returned to the kitchen, though I could hear the soft scratch of her pencil continuing across the paper as she moved from room to room. The confidence in her movements told me everything I needed to know. In her mind, the house was already hers. Later in the afternoon, I climbed the stairs again and entered the bedroom where Noel and I had spent so many years together. The wooden box remained exactly where I'd left it on the dresser. I opened it once more and removed the envelope, reading the document again, slowly from beginning to end. Each sentence carried the same calm clarity it had the night before. The trust protected the house. The authority rested entirely with me. There was no confusion in the language, no room for interpretation. When I finished reading, I placed the document back inside the envelope and returned it to the box. Then I did something that surprised even myself. I smiled. It was a small smile, quiet and steady, the kind Noel used to wear whenever he solved a difficult problem without needing to raise his voice. Downstairs, Romy continued measuring walls and discussing renovation ideas aloud over the phone with someone I could not hear. Her voice carried the excitement of someone already imagining a future she believed was certain. I closed the bedroom door softly and sat for a moment at the edge of the bed, listening to the distant sound of her conversation drifting up the staircase. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the curtains and settled across the floor in long golden lines. Outside, the maple leaves moved slowly in the breeze, scattering a few bright red shapes across the lawn Noel loved so much. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something settle firmly into place inside my chest. Not anger, not sadness, something calmer than both. The understanding that sometimes the most powerful response to arrogance is silence, especially when the truth is already written on paper, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. And while Romy continued planning her renovations downstairs, neither she nor Daniel had any idea that the house they were redesigning existed inside a future they did not control. The following morning unfolded with the quiet rhythm that had always defined life in the house on Maple Ridge Drive. Sunlight filtered through the tall kitchen windows, spreading across the floor in soft rectangles of gold, while the coffee maker hummed gently beside the counter. I woke earlier than usual and dressed before anyone else came downstairs. For a moment, I stood by the bedroom window, looking out over the backyard where Noel had spent so many weekends tending the small garden behind the maple trees. The grass still carried a faint shimmer of dew, and the cool autumn air drifted through the slightly open window. I had slept better than I expected, not because the grief had lessened, but because something inside me had become steady. I knew something they did not know. I walked downstairs and began preparing breakfast the way I had done for decades, moving through the kitchen with slow, familiar motions. Eggs in the pan, bread into the toaster, coffee poured into 3 mugs instead of 2. Romy entered the room a few minutes later wearing a pale sweater and holding her phone in one hand. She looked surprised to see the table already set. For a brief moment, her expression softened into something almost pleasant before the usual distance returned to her face. Daniel came down shortly after that, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt while glancing at his watch. They both sat at the table, and for several minutes the only sounds in the room were forks touching plates and the quiet ticking of the clock above the refrigerator. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly. His tone carried the careful politeness people use when discussing something uncomfortable but necessary. He said he had been thinking about the conversation from 2 nights earlier and believed it would be best if we set a clear timeline. He explained that he and Romy had begun exploring renovation ideas and wanted to move forward with their plans before winter arrived. Romy nodded beside him, adding that contractors in the area usually book projects months in advance and that delaying decisions could complicate everything. I listened without interrupting, folding my hands around the warm mug in front of me. They spoke with the calm confidence of people who believed the outcome was already settled. Daniel even suggested that he could help me find a comfortable senior community nearby, somewhere with social activities and friendly neighbors. Romy mentioned that one of her colleagues had recently moved her own mother into a similar place, and that it had worked out beautifully for everyone involved. Their voices remained polite, almost gentle, as though kindness could soften the reality of what they were asking. When they finished speaking, the kitchen fell quiet again. I looked at Daniel carefully. In that moment, I saw not the little boy who once followed Noelle through the garden with a plastic shovel, but a grown man who had convinced himself that practicality justified everything. I placed my mug on the table and spoke slowly so that my words carried the same calm certainty I felt inside. I told them there was no need to rush any decisions. I explained that I had begun reviewing some documents Noelle had organized before he passed away, and that I would need a little time to go through everything properly. Daniel seemed relieved by my answer, interpreting it as agreement rather than patience. Romy offered a small smile and said that of course they understood that sorting through paperwork after a loss could take time. They both stood a few minutes later and began preparing to leave for the day, Daniel heading toward the office and Romy gathering her laptop and phone for a meeting across town. The front door closed behind them with a quiet click, leaving the house wrapped once again in its familiar stillness. I cleared the breakfast dishes slowly and carried them to the sink. Outside, the maple leaves drifted gently across the lawn as a breeze moved through the yard. The house felt peaceful in a way it had not for several days, as if the walls themselves understood that the balance of the situation had shifted. After finishing the dishes, I walked upstairs and entered the bedroom where Noelle and I had spent so many years together. The wooden box remained on the dresser, exactly where I had left it. I opened the lid and removed the envelope once more, reading the document again with careful attention. The legal language was clear. The trust placed the property entirely under my authority. No renovation, sale, or transfer could occur without my approval. I folded the document again and placed it back inside the envelope before closing the box. Then, I sat quietly at the edge of the bed, looking around the room that held the life Noelle and I had built together. Downstairs, the house remained silent, waiting. Daniel and Romy believed they were preparing for a future that belonged to them. But the truth, written in Noelle's careful planning and sealed within that envelope, meant that the house on Maple Ridge Drive still stood exactly where it always had. And the person who would decide its future was not the one they expected. 2 days passed quietly after that conversation at the breakfast table, and the rhythm of the house continued with an almost ordinary calm that might have fooled someone who did not know the truth waiting quietly beneath the surface. Daniel left for work early each morning, his briefcase in one hand and his phone in the other, speaking about meetings and deadlines as if the future of the house had already been arranged. Romy spent long hours walking through the rooms with a notebook and a measuring tape, occasionally stopping to take photographs of the walls or the kitchen cabinets. She spoke often about renovations and design ideas, sometimes on the phone with contractors and sometimes directly to Daniel when he returned home in the evening. I listened quietly from the background, moving through the same spaces where Noelle and I had built our life together, observing the way they described changes that had not yet happened. One afternoon, I sat in the living room beside the window while Romy stood in the dining room discussing wall colors with someone over the phone. She described removing the old chandelier, replacing the wooden floors, even widening the doorway that led to the kitchen. Her voice carried a sense of excitement that reminded me of someone preparing for a new beginning. The words echoed through the house in a way that felt strangely detached from reality, like plans being drawn on paper for a place that existed only in imagination. I folded my hands in my lap and watched the sunlight move slowly across the carpet. The maple trees outside were beginning to lose more leaves now, small flashes of red and gold drifting down across the lawn Noel had cared for every weekend. The quiet beauty of the yard remained unchanged, unaffected by the conversations happening inside the house. Later that evening, Daniel joined Romy in the dining room while she showed him the measurements she had taken. They spoke in low voices about possibilities for expanding the space, perhaps removing one wall to create a larger kitchen area. I heard Daniel laugh softly at one point, the sound carrying the same easy tone he used when discussing plans for a vacation or a new car. It was clear that in his mind the transformation of the house was already underway. I sat at the table with a cup of tea and allowed their conversation to continue without interruption. Noel used to say that people often reveal more through confidence than through doubt, and I could see now exactly what he meant. The more certain Daniel and Romy became about their future here, the less they paid attention to my quiet presence in the room. The following morning brought a small but important change. Daniel arrived home earlier than usual in the afternoon, carrying a folder beneath his arm. He placed it on the kitchen counter and called Romy into the room with a voice that carried a note of satisfaction. I stood nearby rinsing a plate in the sink while they opened the folder together. Inside were printed pages showing renovation sketches and estimates from a contractor Daniel had spoken with earlier that day. Romy studied the drawings with visible excitement, pointing to sections of the kitchen and dining room while discussing timelines and budgets. At one point, Daniel glanced in my direction and cleared his throat politely before speaking. He explained that the contractor believed the renovation could begin within a month if everything moved quickly. He added that it might be best if I finalized my moving plans soon so that the work could start before winter weather complicated the schedule. I dried my hands slowly with a kitchen towel and walked toward the table where the drawings were spread across the surface. For a moment, I looked at the images of the house redesigned with new walls, new windows, and unfamiliar spaces that did not exist yet. Then I looked up at Daniel. His expression was calm and confident, the expression of someone who believed he was offering a reasonable solution. I nodded once and told him that I understood his desire to move forward with plans. I said that I would review my own documents carefully that evening so we could discuss everything properly the following day. Daniel seemed relieved by my answer, interpreting it as cooperation rather than patience. Romy smiled politely and gathered the papers back into the folder, already speaking again about paint colors and new cabinets. When the conversation ended, I walked quietly upstairs and entered the bedroom. The wooden box still rested on the dresser, exactly where I had left it. I opened the lid and lifted the envelope once more, feeling the weight of the document inside. Downstairs, I could hear Daniel and Romy discussing renovation details with growing excitement. They believed tomorrow would bring the final step toward claiming the house as their own. But as I stood there holding the envelope Noel had prepared years earlier, I understood something they did not. Tomorrow would indeed change everything, just not in the way they expected. The next morning arrived with a crisp chill in the air that made the maple leaves outside shimmer softly in the early light. I woke before the alarm clock beside the bed had the chance to ring, and for a moment I lay still beneath the blankets listening to the quiet breathing of the house. It had been several days since the dinner conversation that changed everything, yet the walls around me still held the same familiar calm they always had. The wooden floor creaked gently as I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the yard stretched peacefully beneath a pale sky, the same yard Noel had mowed every Saturday morning for more than 30 years. I could almost see him there again, pushing the old mower across the grass while Daniel chased fallen leaves near the maple trees. That memory lingered in my mind for a moment before I turned away from the window and dressed slowly for the day ahead. Downstairs, I could already hear voices in the kitchen. Daniel and Romy were awake earlier than usual, speaking with the kind of quiet excitement people have when they believe something important is about to happen. When I entered the room, I noticed several papers spread across the dining table. Floor plans, renovation estimates, and a printed email from the contractor Daniel had mentioned the day before. Romy looked up from the table with a polite smile that barely masked her anticipation. She greeted me warmly and explained that the contractor would be stopping by later that afternoon to take measurements for the renovation work. Daniel nodded in agreement, adding that it would be helpful if we finalized the timeline for my move before the contractor arrived so that everything could proceed smoothly. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, listening carefully while they spoke about demolition schedules and new cabinetry. Their voices carried the confident rhythm of people already planning their future in this house. Romy even mentioned the possibility of removing the old dining room wall entirely to create an open kitchen space. I looked around the room quietly, taking in the same wooden floors Noelle had polished every spring, the same chandelier that had hung above the table since Daniel was a teenager. Every corner of the house held a memory that belonged to the life Noelle and I had built together. Yet Daniel and Romy discussed those memories as though they were outdated furniture waiting to be replaced. When their conversation slowed, Daniel leaned forward slightly and asked if I had finished reviewing the documents I mentioned the previous day. His voice was calm, but carried a clear expectation beneath it. I nodded once and placed my coffee mug carefully on the table. I told them that I had indeed looked through the documents Noelle left behind and that they were quite thorough. Romy's expression brightened immediately, clearly interpreting my words as confirmation that the next step would be arranging my departure. She asked kindly if I had found a suitable place to move and suggested that she could help pack some of the larger items from the bedroom later in the week. I listened to her suggestions without interrupting, allowing a few seconds of silence to settle over the table before I stood from my chair. Neither of them seemed concerned by my calmness. In fact, they appeared relieved, as though the most difficult part of the situation had already passed. I walked slowly from the dining room toward the staircase and climbed to the bedroom, where the wooden box remained on the dresser. The envelope rested inside exactly where Noelle had left it years earlier. I picked it up and held it in my hands for a moment, feeling the steady weight of the document inside. Downstairs, I could hear Daniel and Romy continuing their conversation about renovation plans, their voices drifting upward through the quiet house. They believed that by the end of the day, the contractor would arrive to begin transforming the place they already considered their own. I returned to the dining room, carrying the envelope with me. Daniel looked up as I entered, his expression curious but relaxed. Romy followed his gaze and smiled politely, expecting perhaps a list of moving arrangements or financial paperwork. Instead, I placed the envelope gently on the table between them. The room fell silent. I told them that Noelle had been a careful man who rarely left important matters unresolved. I explained that several years earlier he had arranged something that would determine exactly what happened to the house on Maple Ridge Drive after he was gone. Daniel frowned slightly and reached for the envelope, clearly unsure what to expect. Romy leaned closer to read the first page as he unfolded the document. Their expressions changed slowly as their eyes moved across the printed words. The confidence that had filled the room moments earlier began to fade into something quieter, something uncertain. I remained standing beside the table while they continued reading. Outside, the maple leaves drifted gently across the lawn in the cool autumn breeze, and the house that Noelle and I built together stood exactly as it always had, waiting for the truth that had been written long before any renovation plans were ever imagined. Daniel finished reading the document slowly, the papers still held between his fingers as the silence in the dining room grew heavier with every passing second. Romy leaned closer to him, her eyes moving rapidly across the lines of legal language, as if searching for a sentence that might change what they had just discovered. Outside the tall windows, the maple leaves continued drifting across the lawn, their quiet movement the only motion in a room that had suddenly become very still. I remained standing beside the table with my hands resting lightly on the back of a chair, watching them carefully. The confidence that had filled the house only moments earlier had faded from Daniel's face, replaced by the kind of confusion that comes when a person realizes they have misunderstood something important. He looked up at me finally, his voice uncertain for the first time since this conversation began. He asked if the document meant what he believed it meant. I nodded once and explained calmly that, Noel had created the trust 5 years earlier, long before anyone imagined the events that brought us to this moment. I told them that the property on Maple Ridge Drive had been placed entirely under the authority of the trust, and that I was now responsible for every decision connected to it. Romy straightened slowly in her chair, the folder of renovation plans still resting beside her hand. Her expression shifted from surprise to disbelief, as though she was struggling to reconcile the reality in front of her with the future she had already imagined. Daniel lowered the document to the table and ran one hand across his forehead while reading the first paragraph again. The room remained quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock above the kitchen doorway. After a moment, he spoke again, his voice softer than before. He said he had never known Noel arranged anything like this, and that he assumed the house would simply pass to him after the funeral. I told him gently that Noel had believed planning ahead was a form of protection for the people he loved. He understood that circumstances can change, and that clarity prevents confusion later on. Romy picked up the second page of the document and read through it carefully, her earlier excitement replaced by a thoughtful silence. The renovation drawings beside her looked suddenly out of place against the polished wood of the dining table. For several minutes, none of us spoke. The house seemed to hold its breath along with us, as if the walls themselves were listening. Finally, Daniel leaned back in his chair and looked around the room slowly. His gaze moved across the familiar details he had known since childhood. The chandelier above the table, the wooden floor that Noel had installed by hand, the photographs along the hallway wall showing birthdays and holidays from years that now felt far away. I could see the moment when understanding settled quietly into his expression. He asked me what I intended to do next. I answered with the same calm honesty that Noel always used when explaining difficult decisions. I told him that the house would remain exactly as it was for now, because it still belonged to the life Noel and I built together. I said there was no immediate need for renovations or demolition or any of the changes they had been planning. The rooms held memories that deserved time and respect. Romy listened carefully while I spoke, her earlier certainty replaced by something quieter, perhaps even reflective. She closed the folder containing the renovation plans and rested both hands on the table. Daniel nodded slowly, as if he were reconsidering the situation from a different perspective. The afternoon sunlight moved across the floor and climbed gradually along the dining room wall, where Noel once marked Daniel's height each year while he was growing up. Those small pencil lines remained there, even now, faint reminders of a time when the future felt simpler for all of us. I picked up the envelope and placed the document back inside before sliding it gently across the table toward Daniel. I told him he was welcome to read it again whenever he wished, because there was nothing hidden in its words. Everything Noel intended was written clearly on those pages long before any of us imagined standing here discussing the future of this house. Daniel looked at the envelope for a moment, but did not open it again. Instead, he folded his hands together and sat quietly, absorbing the reality that had replaced the assumptions he carried for so long. Outside, the wind moved softly through the maple trees while the house on Maple Ridge Drive stood exactly where it had always stood, grounded in the careful decisions of the man who built it and the quiet patience of the woman he trusted to protect it after he was gone.